Today I'm joined by Francesco Femia, who is the CEO of the Council on Strategic Risk, as well as the co-founder of the Center for Climate and Security, and a senior advisor to the International Military Council on Climate and Security. Welcome.
Thanks for having me, Scott.
All right, so maybe we could just kind of step back and just give us a kind of a big picture. You're involved in lots of different organizations. Tell me about your role. What are the things that you're looking at?
Sure. Well, I'm the CEO of the Council on Strategic Risk, as you mentioned, and one of the big things we do there, amongst a few other things, is look at climate change from a security perspective. And what we like to say is we're not an environmental organization that is concerned about security. Rather, we're a security organization that's worried about climate change. So all that means is, we look at it from that lens. So when we think about what the climate is doing and what we're doing to the climate, we think about the consequences on our security. And that ranges from, what it means for our military to what it means for our personal security, at the community level, what it means for our critical infrastructure, energy systems, what have you, and also what it means for our relationship, for example, with great powers like China and Russia. As the Arctic is melting, what does that do to our security? So that's how we look at those things. It doesn't really tell you what I do, but it does tell you what I think about. And then what I do in that context is I'm involved in essentially a number of projects around analyzing these security issues, but then also developing policy solutions as well. And just next Tuesday, actually, we're going to be releasing a climate security plan for America. 64 military intelligence and national security leaders are signing on to that plan, and essentially calling on the president, either this president or the future president, to come up with a new national strategy for dealing with climate change and its security implications on a very broad level and in a very robust level. And so I'm managing that, and then also talking to people like you and others and trying to get this message heard across the United States, not just here in Washington where I sit.
So you bring up a really interesting point, which is that you essentially act as a policy and a think tank in terms of the security impact from something like climate change and other massive tectonic changes. But at the end of the day, even if that compilation of the analysis and the policy implications are well compiled and presented to the acting president, what really truly happens after that? And do you even have influence in terms of whether that gets even read, interpreted, and properly integrated into the overall defense policies?
Yeah, well, first of all, there's actually, for us in the work we do, more of an open door than you might think. While in the existing political climate, the White House, or at least the leader, of the executive branch, the president, may seem a little bit, of a denier on this issue. There are a lot of people at senior levels throughout the U.S. government, for example, at the Department of Defense, in the intelligence community, at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, for example, and at the State Department, who actually continue to do the work of trying to keep this country safe from climate risk, because they see climate change as just another significant risk that we have to prepare for and deal with. And so, we, for example, just one, I think, really striking example that a lot of people might not be aware of is that at least 34 in our count, maybe we've missed some, senior defense leaders, 30 of whom were appointed by this president, have called climate change a security issue. And have actually put in requests and plans and reports about climate change and delivered those to Congress, for example. And so we actually do have an open interest from different parts of the U.S. government in our work to try to change federal policy. Now, it's a little bit harder at the White House level, but we've even had some influence there. There was an attempt, earlier this year, back in February, by the National Security Council to actually suppress climate science and climate analysis from coming from the science agencies, but also the intelligence community and the Defense Department and other agencies. We got wind of that, and the Washington Post reported on it. And then that was so embarrassing for the White House that they nixed that whole plan. And then the person who was responsible for it, who was a famous climate denier, left. And so we had influence in that sense as well, because what we did in that context was we heard about it. We didn't just hear about it. we got together over 50 senior military and national security and former intelligence folks, as we're going to be doing next Tuesday with this report, and said, hey, it's a really bad idea to politicize science. And it's a really, really bad idea to politicize intelligence analysis. You can disagree on policy, but to say, it's almost a Soviet-style effort to say you can't even produce this science and can't even produce this analysis and show it to Congress, the American people, is a real red line for people in the security community. So we came out against that, and that was pretty embarrassing. And I think it's a weak position for the White House to be in, because also the Congress, including the Republican Party, has moved on. There are very few deniers in the Congress. So the debate right now there is on how ambitious we should be and how big of a problem. So you'll find very few Republicans even that'll say, oh, climate change isn't an issue at all. They'll disagree on the gravity of it and also on the scale of what we need to do. So we have actually the political, pieces are in place to actually have some influence. And we also do a lot with Congress. And there have been climate provisions passed in a bunch of different bits of legislation on this issue as well, including defense bills, stuff like that. So we have a bit of an open door, but the ambition level is not there yet. And that's because it takes leadership at the top to really deal with this in an economy-wide way, but also in a global way. And the president's not doing that. So that's a problem, but we can put a lot of pressure either on him or on the candidates, to make sure that what they're proposing is enough for dealing with this major security problem.
Well, I think you may have just made my Friday, and for those that are listening, this recording was taped as of September 20th, and there is an active youth march on climate change that's happening throughout the world. So it's very timely. And the fact that, I think for the constituency and the citizens of the United States to know that there are 30 or more military leaders and intelligence officers that recognize the gravity of climate change impact to security, and that they're actively analyzing, planning, and potentially even allocating resources to address this issue is, frankly, one of the best things I've heard all day. So thank you so much for that. So let's get back to this report that you were mentioning. So what are some key highlights in terms of some of the things that you're bringing to the forefront of the Congress and some of the leaders in the military branches as well as in the intelligence community?
Sure. So on Tuesday, we'll be releasing what we've called a climate security plan for America. And it is a presidential plan, or a proposed one. We're basically saying, here's what the President of the United States should be doing to deal with the broader security risks of climate change, both here at home and also abroad. And what's at the center of that is both fulfilling rather a responsibility to prepare for and prevent the significant security risks of a changing climate. So that's kind of the big ticket thing. So we need a plan for the United States at the federal level to deal with it, or at least to get things moving. So that's what we're calling for. And, and it involves sort of four key components. One is leadership. So in order to deal with a vital national security threat, we need leadership at the top. When we deal with other security risks in the United States, for example, nuclear proliferation, the spread of nuclear weapons to countries that we think might not be responsible, actors when it comes to nuclear weapons. When we think about global terrorism and the other things that occupy the minds of those who care about national security, we put senior leadership at the top. We create departments and agencies like the Homeland Security Department that was, as we know, created after 9/11. We put billions of dollars into dealing with that threat, every year, just to make sure that some of the consequences don't even happen, never mind that we're managing those consequences. So the consequences of, a nuclear weapon exploding is so intolerable that we put a lot of effort into making sure that doesn't happen. So on climate change, we think the same kind of effort needs to happen. So there need to be senior people in place. We call for a White House office on climate security, for example, led by a senior official that reports directly to the president. That will deal with climate security issues across the whole of government and move the whole, all departments and agencies, towards dealing with this in a pretty robust way. So that's kind of the big thing we're asking for is that new office. We're also asking for the president to create a national strategy on climate and security, and issue essentially what is similar to an executive order, but maybe a bit more serious, which would be a national strategy directive. That would be brand new. It would be very similar to to what President Eisenhower actually did after World War II when he was trying to figure out how to move the U.S. government to confront the Soviet threat. Now, there were definitely mistakes made during the Cold War on how to do that, but we think that it takes that kind of effort to move the United States strategically against this risk. So those are kind of a few of the big ticket items. We have there's about 35 pages worth of recommendations, but we really think it starts with calling for a plan, calling for a security strategy, putting someone in place at the top who can help do that. And then also having people at each of the department and agencies who are climate security senior officials to kind of move that forward. Now we haven't even gotten to money. Obviously, we think this is going to take significant amount of resources. I think anybody who says it's not going to cost anything is lying to you, or just doesn't know what they're talking about. And so it's definitely going to cost money to do this. But we certainly believe that putting the investment in now is going to head off, future costs, and not just financial costs, but certainly costs in terms of security in American lives. And so that's kind of at the top of what we're asking.
Well, I think you could tell that the plan is very bold, and you are, in effect, not just recommending, but you're really almost demanding it in a way that it's a necessity. And you provided some parallels to some other policies in the past as well. But that level of gravity, that kind of macro national level of policy changes, ensuring there's leadership, ensuring that there's an office that it's handling both the plan and the strategy and the execution of this. This is a pretty paramount, as well as very bold, tectonic type of a proposal that you guys are looking to submit.
I think so, and that's definitely what we want, and I think you're absolutely right. I mean, we don't say in our report that we're demanding action on this, but we are. And so and I think it's out of necessity, as you mentioned. We don't have the luxury of waiting any longer on this. And you've often heard, I think, in reports that we have about 10 years or 12 years before runaway climate change becomes completely catastrophic. And then there's very little we can do to deal with that. I really think we just have a few years to put in place the structures necessary to deal with the issue in the next 10 years. Because, we're a democracy. It takes a lot to move the ship of state and to move resources and make sure those resources are actually affecting the climate system and bringing down our emissions, and also in terms of adaptation. And so we need to start in the next couple of years of this major effort. Otherwise, I think we're going to run into some potentially catastrophic risks in the future. And I think what's important about this plan is, there are a lot of bold plans out there, and I applaud a lot of them. But this plan's actually coming from an unusual group of people, as I've mentioned before. This is, we have 8 retired 4-star generals and admirals who are signing on to this. We have a former head of NASA. We have a former chair of the National Intelligence Council. These are people who are very serious about the security of the United States. And they're saying this is one of the most significant security risks we're facing. And it's also, by the way, potentially benefiting some of our adversaries like China, who are trying to step in and lead on it. And we're losing globally because we're not leading. And I think, and then we see, Russia, for example, operating in the Arctic in a way that puts us at a disadvantage. So even if you aren't altruistic about this, there's a real self-interest motive here, not just in terms of jobs and building a green economy, but also in terms of our national security. And I think that's what this plan gets across.
Yeah, I really like the way you frame that. Now, let's get real concrete. You mentioned the Arctic a couple of times already. For the listeners and the viewers, can you give a few examples on the types of risks that we're talking about?
Sure. Well, not that long ago, the current Secretary of the Navy, appointed by the President, was asked why the Navy was doing another Arctic strategy. And his response was funny. He said, "The damn thing melted." And so we need a new strategy and what he was basically saying, a little facetiously, was that there's a new ocean up there for now a much longer time during the year. And so the U.S. has to operate in this new ocean, and that includes its Navy. And what's happening now is that Russia, China, and other Arctic nations are developing plans for doing more in the Arctic. That means using it as a trade route, Also, you might see more commercial activity in general, including tourist activity in the Arctic. And any ships that are entering the Arctic are likely to require some kind of military escort. And so there's a lot of activity that's happening now in the Arctic that wasn't before. There's likely to be a lot more, and the U.S. is not prepared. What do I mean by that? Well, just here's one interesting concrete example. Russia has over 45 icebreakers, and the United States has 2. Now, icebreakers are ships that can deal with ice. They can essentially, run through ice and not worry about their hulls getting punctured. And it sounds a little counterintuitive because you would think, well, there's less ice, so you need fewer icebreakers, right? But that's not the case at all. The more activity that's happening there, the more presence we have in the Arctic, the more of those icebreakers we'll need, to operate effectively. And Russia's prepared to do it, and we're not. So, that's partly why the military cares about what's going on there. But then also we're likely to see just a rush for resources too in the seabed in the Arctic. And should we be doing that? That's a really good question, because a lot of those resources are fossil fuels. But if some of that's going to be happening, we need to be there, we need to be prepared for it, and we need to make some investments now to make sure we're prepared for it. So that's a little bit about what's going on in the Arctic. Yeah.
Now, one of the terms that you referenced, and we had this conversation before a little bit, is around black swan events. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so in the intelligence community, the broader community really thinks about the element of and being prepared for the surprise or black swans. Now, what that means is essentially, to put it very simply, an issue or a risk that you're simply not prepared for. That can be very catastrophic. And so with a change in climate, because it's so complex, we can predict a lot of what the climate's going to be doing in 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. But if there's a tipping point, which there could be, and some climate scientists say there is, then we might have a whole range of very catastrophic effects. And to give an example, we might find ourselves, including here in the United States, in a position where we're seeing multiple major storms happening all at the same time. Wildfires happening both on the West Coast but also on the East Coast of the United States, one after the other simultaneously. And then as we're trying to recover from one storm, we're getting hit with another. If we have sort of a major tipping point in the climate and the weather system and the storm system completely flips, we will not be prepared for that at all. So I think the most important thing we can do, and we say this in the plan, is put a lot of attention also into prevention. And on the security side, we have to prepare for the unavoidable security risks, but we also have to prevent the unmanageable ones, the black swans as well. And because there's nothing worse from a security perspective than an unmanageable problem. And so some of the climate scenarios that the IPCC has shown, but also that the security community does, to show us a future of some pretty unmanageable climate scenarios if we're not careful and if we don't reduce our emissions quickly. So that's what, you don't want a black swan, and you don't want to assume that you won't get a black swan. So you have to be prepared now. But the best way to prepare is to make sure that the climate system stays stable.
So you mentioned Russia, but let's talk more broadly in terms of what are some state actors that could take advantage of what's happening in climate change to potentially increase their military power or influence?
Well, I think China is an interesting example in this case. We think of China as, the term used in Washington is our near-peer competitor. That's essentially a polite way of saying an adversary, but we do work with China on a number of issues, and we need to work with China. But China, I think the way they look at this issue is, look, if the United States is going to pull back on both its emissions commitments, but also in investments in climate adaptation in the world, then if we step in as a leader, then we're going to benefit. And we're going to benefit in terms of making investments in countries in our neighborhood that are vulnerable to climate change, in Southeast Asia and Indonesia and other parts of the region. We're going to make those investments and we'll gain influence. And then that influence is going to help us compete for the United States around the South China Sea, for example, which China, sees as its own backyard. But that's not just sort of relegated to the Asia Pacific region. China is making major investments in clean energy systems, in climate resilience and adaptation in Africa, in South America, the U.S.'s backyard, if you will. And so it really does see a strategic opportunity in U.S. in action, and that's a pretty big problem. On a different level, we do see also examples of non-state actors, global terrorist organizations or regional ones as well, taking advantage of climate change and the stress it's putting on water resources. For example, Al-Shabaab and Al-Qaeda and some other organizations sometimes use scarce water resources as a weapon, or they'll weaponize that water and use that as leverage against either local populations or the governments that they're fighting. For example, ISIS has done this in Iraq by seizing the Mosul Dam, which was experiencing drought. So we see different ways in which U.S. adversaries can take advantage of climate change and U.S. inaction, to gain leverage. And I think that's part of the picture. We certainly look at that. I think the American public should know more about these things, because it's really about, their security as well.
Terrific. So on that note, how can people get a hold of your work and some of the organizations that you're involved with?
Sure. So people can find us at www.climateinsecurity.org. And it's really one of the only institutions in the world that focuses exclusively on this intersection of climate and security. You can find us there. On Twitter, we're at CNTR CLIMSEC. We might have to do something about that, but it's Center ClimSec on Twitter. And we also have some parallel organizations like the International Military Council on Climate and Security, which is made up of 24 different countries that we chair, that includes militaries from all over the world. And that's at www.imccs.org. And on Tuesday, if you go to climateinsecurity.org /climate security plan for America, you can read the new plan that we're putting out.
Terrific. Can't wait to see it. So today I've been joined by Francesco Femia, who is the CEO of the Council on Strategic Risk, as well as a co-founder for the Center for Climate and Security. Francesco, it's been a real pleasure. Thanks for joining.
Scott, thanks for having me, and I hope I didn't depress you too.